From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
So, Kim, now that these congressional leaders have made a deal on the top line spending figure, where does this debate go from here? And remember that we now have what is called a laddered spending situation where there are 4 of the 12 annual appropriations bills where they've been funded temporarily through January 19th. So 4 of those spending pieces expire next Friday. And then there's 8 more that expire with a different deadline on February 2nd. And that includes the one that covers the Pentagon. And so that is a pretty tight legislative timeline, Kim. Can they get this through and get it to the president's desk and get it signed into law before those deadlines? Or are we looking at another showdown over a potential government shutdown or maybe another short-term spending package to kick those deadlines further out into 2024?
All eyes now move to that conservative right in the House. Not that they're necessarily going to be definitive in what happens next, although I think what's going to happen is that Johnson is going to give them a choice. The House has passed all 12 of its spending bills through committee. It's passed another 7 of them through the House off the floor. 5 of them are sitting waiting for action on the House floor. The Senate has only passed 3 bills out of the Senate. In theory, what you would like to see happen here is that each of those bills gets passed. There's a conference committee set up for each of those bills, and then they come up with a solution. The final product goes back for a final vote to the House and Senate. This is what you call regular order. At this point, as you know, Kyle, it's going to be a little difficult probably to do that on a one-on-one basis. But the question is, how much input do House conservatives want to have in the products that are sent along to the Senate? So far, a number of House conservatives have blocked the final passage of those remaining 5 bills. I think what Johnson is going to do is say, look, you got a choice here. If you get to work, you can have amendments on the floor. You can have more input into the final thing that goes. But remember that it is not necessary that a bill pass the entire House to be negotiated with the Senate. And I think his view is going to be that if Republicans or his conservative flank insist on just continuing to block any further progress on the floor of the House, that he will move to the next step, which is to try to get an agreement with the Senate. Now, the merit of Republicans really taking part in this debate is what matters in these bills is not just top-line spending figures, but policy writers. You can insert policy into these bills right now. And a lot of people forget this. The country is still operating under all of the policy writers that Nancy Pelosi inserted into her final omnibus spending bill, because that bill has just been continued forward while we wait to get this new set done under continuing resolutions. So there's a real opportunity if Republicans want to engage here to make some big differences. And I think what Johnson's going to do now is say, look, the ball is rolling and it's now kind of up to you how much engagement you're going to have. On the bigger question of getting this stuff done, Kyle, there's a real possibility that some of these bills, while they might have been passed out individually and while they might be dealt with on individual terms in a conference, a number of those bills may end up getting lumped together just because of the time constraints here.
The other piece of this spending debate that I think is important to highlight is that policy writers is not the only motivation for members of Congress and Republicans to try to get these appropriations bills agreed to. The other one is this provision in the debt ceiling deal that was negotiated between Kevin McCarthy, signed by President Biden last year, that says that if those 12 bills do not go through, then there is a 1% sequestration of discretionary funds, which, Kate, would be not a great way of managing the Pentagon and the military budget in particular. And so there are many defense hawks that are worried about that. And there's some reporting that although we are now in a continuing resolution, a short-term spending deal past the beginning of the new fiscal year, the way that the provision is being interpreted by the Office of Management and Budget is that those 1% cuts will not kick in until April 30th. So there are a few more months if Congress wants to get together and get these bills out the door that they can avoid that outcome that I think many Republicans and Democrats all want to be avoided.
Right. I mean, to take a step back and talk about how consequential it would be if Congress actually did pass 12 appropriations bills, Republicans have been running on that for years and returning to regular order. And when you have a 2-vote majority, getting policy riders and spending bills is one typically fruitful area. But given how off course Congress has gotten and how many times it has passed ugly omnibus spending bills and how long this dysfunction has gone on, it would be a victory by itself for Republicans to get back to 12 spending bills and get back to regular order. And that I do think would be an accomplishment they could tout with voters. And it's something that they campaigned on and have been talking about, that Congress is not functioning properly in its job. So that is one thing I think they should be focused on, especially given the limitations of passing conservative policy priorities or balancing the federal budget when you only control one chamber. So that by itself would be an accomplishment. On the narrow question of the sequester, I'm really think we may be heading back to the future sequester politics, as I call it. These 1% across the board cuts were designed to be a hammer that forced Congress to pass the regular appropriations bills. And now what we kind of have is we have some contingent of Republicans who are in favor of the 1% across the board cuts and so are not dissuaded from doing a year-long CR, even a year-long continuing resolution. But I think that would be a mistake for both the reasons of, one, it would be a missed opportunity to get back to regular order, and two, to the point about it would be very unserious about how we handle our national defense and perhaps the worst security environment we've faced in decades. To give you an impression of why that is, continuing resolutions, stopgap budget measures, the Pentagon functions differently than other agencies do. It, for instance, consumes huge amounts of gas, things that it has to buy. It has fixed expenses that it has to pay out the door that get harder to do if you are on a last year's funding levels, and that you have to float all these other things like a pay raise for troops in your last year's funding pot, and the math doesn't work there. But also you have the issue of priorities, and that is Congress has tried to set some priorities for national defense, and one of them, for instance, is buying bombs and munitions in multi-year contracts, and that allows some capital certainty for companies who make them. And the practical import is that we would try to rebuild our weapon stocks that we've noticed in helping Ukraine and helping Israel, that our weapon stocks are insufficient. So we've got this good idea, right? Do multi-year procurement authorities and try to buy some of these bombs at scale. Well, that's an example of something that you can't do if you are functioning under a year-long continuing resolution and you don't have that authority to get going on those contracts. And that's just one small example, and all sorts of programs, including recapitalizing the nuclear deterrent and other programs, would be affected if the Pentagon were stuck on a year-long CR. And it would also just, I think, underscore a total lack of seriousness about the world and the problems that we face, and that we are not serious about managing multiple proliferating threats everywhere from the Red Sea to the South China Sea. So I think that would be a really big mistake on our part to stick with that CR for that reason alone.
Hang tight. We'll be right back with more on the politics of this spending deal. Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Kim, what about the politics and the lessons learned here? The debt deal and those spending figures, when they were negotiated by Kevin McCarthy, were denounced by some of the same Republicans who are now denouncing his successor. And remember, the Republican majority in the House is historically narrow, and it is about to get narrower. Kevin McCarthy has now resigned. Congressman George Santos of New York was expelled. And Ohio Congressman Bill Johnson is about to resign to become the head of Youngstown State University. And so Speaker Johnson will be working with a majority of only 219 votes, which is razor thin. It is basically impossible to get a much narrower majority than that. And so the lesson seems to be that with that kind of a majority, it doesn't matter who is sitting in the speaker's chair or holding the gavel. This is the kind of modest deal that you get. And yet in that same interview of Chip Roy, we played a bit of it earlier, he was asked about, do any of these members of the Freedom Caucus, are they interested in maybe ousting Speaker Johnson from his job now? And he said that he prefers not to go down that road, but he seemed to leave it open as a matter of pressuring the speaker. And Kim, what do you make of that? And is that somewhere that the Republican conference might head? Or is one difference here that they trust Speaker Johnson, even if they don't like this deal, more than they ever trusted Kevin McCarthy?
They might head there, and it would be absolutely dreadful politics for them. As you know, Kyle, this issue is pretty straightforward in terms of what you can negotiate. Okay. And does everyone wish, every conservative wish that this was greater bill than it is? Absolutely. But you own one half of Congress in a Washington where the Senate is controlled by Democrats. So is the White House. There are limits on what you can demand without going down the road of a shutdown. And that's the issue here is, on the one hand, Republicans can lean into this. They can get these bills passed. They can take the win, say, look, we have kept domestic discretionary spending flat, something that has not happened in years and years. We're going to work on that. In the meantime, we have proven that we can govern. We have returned Congress to regular order. Look, yay, no omnibuses at the end of the year. We did our budget duty correctly. Put it aside and then turn attention back to the White House's major messes, including the border disaster that's going on right now, where the White House is on the back foot. Or they can make this all about themselves and engage in another meltdown over their own leadership and block their own bills and essentially make the headlines about Republican dysfunction. That is what happens if you go down the road of suggesting that you're going to defenestrate another Republican speaker. It's an option, but I think I agree with you a little bit more, Kyle, that a lot of conservatives, while they're going to complain about this deal, understand that they have a very conservative speaker in Mike Johnson, one that they wanted more than they wanted Kevin McCarthy. It would be the height of problems for them to now undermine a guy that they willingly took on in their leadership.
Thank you, Kim and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button. And we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.